I took my 7-year-old son tent camping last summer at a small, private campground along a quiet stretch of river. It wasn't a big state park with RVs lined up in neat rows and people everywhere. The place was mostly used by locals who fished the river or floated it during the day, and by the evening it got very quiet. I've camped my whole life and spent more nights outdoors than I can count. But that was the first time I had taken him by myself. The day had been perfect. We floated the river, skipped rocks along the banks, and cooked hot dogs over a campground grill. By the time the sun disappeared behind the trees, he was completely exhausted. Our campsite sat in a wide clearing with forest on 3 sides and a narrow dirt road cutting through the campground. The river was maybe 100 yards away, and you could hear it moving rocks along with the usual nighttime sounds like crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. The moon that night was almost full, bright enough that the entire clearing looked washed in silver light. We set up our small 2-person tent near the edge of the clearing. My son crawled into his sleeping bag and fell asleep almost immediately, but I didn't. At first I told myself it was normal nerves. Camping alone with your kid feels different because every responsibility sits squarely on you. If something happens, you are the only one there to deal with it. Still, as the night dragged on, a strange uneasiness settled over me that I couldn't shake. It was a distinct feeling that something was watching us. I kept glancing towards the tent walls, half expecting to hear footsteps in the grass or the snap of a branch, but everything outside sounded completely normal. The forest hummed with insects, but the feeling never went away. After what felt like hours of lying there trying to calm myself, my son suddenly sat up beside me and whispered that he needed to use the restroom. The campground bathrooms were about 50 yards away across the clearing. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a short, simple walk. But the thought of stepping out into that open space made my stomach tighten. Still, there was no avoiding it, so I grabbed a small flashlight and unzipped the tent. The moment we stepped outside, the cool night air hit us and the clearing opened up. The brightness was almost surreal. My son held on to my hand as we started walking across the grass towards the bathroom building, and halfway he stopped. Before I could even ask what was wrong, he let out a loud and terrified scream. I asked him what it was, and in that same motion he scrambled behind me and tried to climb onto my back, clinging onto my shoulders. The sound of his voice made my chest drop. "Where?" I asked quickly. "What do you see?" He was pointing towards the far edge of the clearing where the grass met the tree line. Right there, what is that?" I stared at the spot he was pointing at, fully expecting to see a deer or maybe a raccoon in the moonlight. At first, I didn't see anything. Then the grass moved. The movement was subtle. As my eyes adjusted to the contrast between the bright clearing and the darker forest edge, a shape began to separate itself from the shadows. Whatever it was, stood taller than any deer I had ever seen. Its body was long and narrow, and its legs looked strangely elongated in the moonlight. The strangest part was the way it held itself. It did not look like a normal 4-legged animal grazing in the grass, but it also wasn't standing fully upright. Instead, it seemed to be balancing in a halfway posture, as if it could drop to all fours or rise on 2 legs without much effort. For a moment I wondered if the moonlight was playing tricks on me, and then the thing moved. Its head lifted slightly above the tall grass, revealing long, pointed ears that stuck straight up. The outline of its shoulders looked too narrow and too high at the same time, giving it an almost skeletal silhouette against the tree line. As I focused on it, the creature slowly turned its head in our direction. I never saw its face clearly, but I did see its eyes catch the moonlight for a brief moment, in the way an animal's eyes sometimes reflect light in the dark. It stood perfectly still while watching us. That moment probably lasted no more than 2 seconds, but felt much longer. and then, whatever it was, took a single step sideways into the shadows of the trees and disappeared, like it had never been there at all. There was no crashing through the brush and no heavy footsteps running away. The tall grass simply parted and then settled again. My son began screaming even louder, and that was enough to break whatever stunned hesitation held me in place. I picked him up and ran straight towards the campground bathrooms without looking back. Inside the small concrete building, the harsh fluorescent lights made the whole situation feel strangely unreal, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept asking him what he had seen. He just kept saying he didn't know. He didn't know what it was. And after he finished, I carefully pushed the bathroom door open and looked back across the clearing. Nothing was amiss. We hurried back to the tent as quickly as possible, and I zipped it closed the second we were inside. My son somehow fell asleep again within minutes, but I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, worried that that thin piece of canvas was all that was protecting us from a monster, or whatever it was that was lurking at that campground. At first light, I walked back to the spot where I had seen the figure standing. The grass there was pressed down in a narrow path that led straight into the trees, as if something tall had moved through it during the night. I looked for hoofprints or paw tracks in the damp soil, but there was nothing clear enough to identify. We packed up as soon as the sun came up and left the campground in the morning. I have spent my entire life outdoors. I know the animals that live in those woods. I have seen deer, elk, coyotes, and even black bears while camping, and none of them move or stand the way that thing did. What unsettles me the most, though, is that I never noticed it until my son pointed directly at it. The realization made me wonder how long it had been standing at the edge of that clearing watching our tent, before we ever stepped outside. This story is the textbook definition of trust the process. It kind of goes here and there and everywhere, but it always ties together in the end, I promise. Although I've had my fair share of paranormal experiences, I have seen 2 unidentified flying objects in my lifetime. I've personally never had a cryptid experience, but the story I'm about to share is my ex-husband's, and I'm going to tell it to you as it was told to me. We were going to bed one evening, and my ex looked out the window. I playfully teased that there might be a set of red eyes looking back at him, so he better be careful, and I meant no harm in saying that. It was playful banter. He freaked out and went on a tangent about how I wasn't funny and not to say that. I knew he had an experience as a little boy seeing something with red eyes staring at him through the window, which was why I teased him about the subject in the first place. What I didn't know was how severely the incident traumatized him at 5 years old, and I immediately felt horrible and apologized. It was then that he told me the complete story, and I had a much better understanding. He grew up in Evansville, Indiana, and was born in the year of 1972. He lived with his parents and twin brother. He said they had a really great day of t-ball at the local park, and had come home and his dad grilled out on the backyard where their land met the woods. He said something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He didn't feel anything outright malevolent, but something wasn't right either. They'd planned to go out for ice cream after dinner, but that never happened. Instead, the most traumatic event of his childhood occurred. His dad and brother were off somewhere in the house. His mom was at the kitchen sink cleaning their dishes, and the kitchen sink overlooked a huge window. The back part of the house was somewhat elevated, so their kitchen window would have been at least 8 to 9 feet off the ground. As previously stated, the backyard backed up to the woods, so no traffic nor accompanying lights. No lights were on in the backyard or at the surrounding neighbor's yard. Remember, this is 1977, so there were no drones. Whatever he saw, it came from the woods at the back of their house. He said the part he remembered most vividly is everything in his surrounding area slowed down as if he were in slow motion. This is called tachyphasia. The phenomenon occurs during high-stress situations or adrenaline-filled moments. where the brain processes information faster, causing the surrounding world to appear slowed down. It's triggered by fight or flight response, and perception of time is distorted. He looked up at the back of his mother's head, and she was looking down at the sink. It was then that he noticed it. There were two large eyes staring at him, as red as hellfire. He was immediately petrified and glued to the spot he was standing in. There was a black outline, which was hard to discern with the background of the night sky, with no backlighting considering they were right against a wooded area. He couldn't move, he couldn't speak. He was, quite literally, frozen in fear. He said he felt like it had taken control over him, and he was at its mercy. There was no telepathy. It was just an emotion he felt. Finally, after what felt like forever, his mum turned to him and asked what was wrong. By the time he looked at his mum and back at the window, the red-eyed creature with the black body was gone. It was then he burst into tears and hid behind the refrigerator and refused to come out. By this point, his dad came in along with his twin brother to see what the commotion was. His mum was at a loss because she hadn't seen a thing, and they were trying to calm him down enough to find out what happened. He was finally able to blurt out what he'd seen through his sobs. His dad immediately went out to see if he could find anything, and this sent him into a whole new round of tears because he was afraid something would happen to his father. His mum was still trying to comfort him as his dad came back into the house and stated he didn't see a thing. They decided to stay home that evening, and this event ended up scarring him for life, into adulthood and 30 years later. He had to have the curtains and or blinds shut on the windows at night. I have no doubt he actually saw something, and wasn't misremembering an incident he made up as a 5-year-old boy. After finding out the full story, I profusely apologized again and felt quite bad. I had no idea that his sighting of the red eyes out the window was something this gravely traumatic. We discussed a few things about the incident. One thing we discussed was, considering their kitchen window was at least 8 to 9 feet off the ground, this red-eyed creature had to have been at least that tall, if not taller. He wasn't sure if it had a black body, but due to it being nighttime with no backlighting, he couldn't make out any fur, skin, or feathers on the creature's body. Remember that when I said this was a trust the process story? I'm going to need you to do that exactly right now. So roughly 6 months after the incident with the red-eyed creature, now in December, a catastrophic tragedy happened in Evansville on December 13th at 7 p.m. Air Indiana Flight 216 lost control and crashed shortly after takeoff from Evansville Regional Airport, carrying the University of Evansville basketball team, the Evansville Purple Aces. The plane was on its way to the Nashville International Airport, taking the team to play the Middle Tennessee Blue Raiders in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. According to Wikipedia, the National Transportation Safety Board blamed the crash on the pilot's failure to remove the gust locks on the right aileron, and the rudder broke before takeoff, as well as an overload baggage compartment. The NTSB reported that the plane might have been able to stay airborne had only one of the problems existed. As it was, the extra baggage shifted the plane's center of gravity to the rear, and the locked rudder and aileron made it impossible to control the overweight aircraft. Head coach Bobby Watson was the only coach on board the flight, and his assistant coaches were on scouting assignments at the time. Athletic director Jim Byers had planned to board the plane, but stayed behind to interview a candidate for a baseball program. 4 of the passengers were still breathing when found by rescuers, with 3 dying on the scene and 1 dying hours after the incident. The only member of the Purple Aces who did not die in the crash was an 18-year-old freshman, David Furr. He was out of the season with an ankle injury and thus not on the plane that day. 2 weeks after the crash, Furr and his younger brother Byram were killed in a car accident near Newton, Illinois, leaving the entire 1977 Evansville Baseball Purple Aces basketball team dead. Yes, just like in Final Destination. After consideration, the rest of the season was cancelled. 29 people lost their lives in total that night. Now, years after the incident of teasing my ex-husband about the red eyes at the window, we're divorced, not because of that of course, but as I'm sitting watching TV, I'm watching Monsters and Mysteries because I pretty much would watch that show whenever it was on because I really liked it. And this episode had a segment about the Point Pleasant monster and prophecies. The story starts out with a group of teenagers hanging out in the old leftover World War II TNT bunkers of Point Pleasant in 1966. The kids are hanging out and drinking and doing what kids do. Well, one of the couples looked over and saw a pair of huge red bulbous eyes and a black-winged creature that was between 7 to 9 feet tall flying over them. From November 1996 through to December of 1997, numerous sightings of this creature were spotted by the denizens of Point Pleasant. Some descriptions varied on small points, but the main descriptors always remained the same. Large, between 7 to 9 feet in height, dark grey to black in colour, huge wings with the ability to fly and talons for feet. Most of all, the most distinct feature by far were the large glowing red eyes. Some residents that were close to the creature during sighting suffered burns on and around their eyes similar to welder's arc burn. Everyone said they had an overwhelming sense of foreboding when they were in the presence of the creature, and the locals started referring to the creature as the Mothman. It all came to a head at 5 p.m. on December 15th, 1967. Packed full of Christmas shoppers, the silver bridge overlooking the Ohio River was jammed. On both ends of the bridge, the red stoplights were frozen and the vehicles were overloaded on the bridge. It was then that one bar, number 13, broke and the bridge collapsed. The bridge and the vehicles on it tumbled into the Ohio River below, and 46 people perished in the icy waters among the remnants of the Silver Bridge. It is, to this date, the worst bridge collapse in United States history. Some residents of Point Pleasant stated that they saw the Mothman flying over the Silver Bridge immediately before it collapsed. Many felt the Mothman caused the bridge's collapse, while just as many felt that the Mothman was a harbinger of doom sent to warn the people about the impending tragedy. For anyone interested in looking into the story further, there's both a movie based on the incident called The Mothman Prophecies, and the book author is John Keel. Now, for those of you who trusted the process and stayed with the story so far, I thank you. I'm certain that the majority of you have already figured out what I did during that particular episode of Monsters and Mysteries. I'm of the opinion that when my ex-husband was 5 years old, the glowing red eyes with the black outline that he saw coming from the woods at the back of their house and looking into their kitchen was none other than the cryptid known as the Mothman. I believe that just like dozens of sightings for a year before the Silver Bridge collapse, he saw the Mothman in the summer of '77, approximately 6 months before the Air Indiana flight. And I tend to agree with the folks that the Mothman is a harbinger of doom, and to warn us on the impending tragedy. There were even reported sightings in New York on September 11th, 2001. For anyone wondering, yes, I still had my ex-husband's phone number, and I did call him and tell him about my theory. It almost seemed to assuage the fear he'd had since he was 5 years old. He, like me, felt that all the information tracked and it made perfect sense. I think he was actually able to put his mind at ease knowing that his Mothman sighting was a one-off and would not happen again. My opinion of the Mothman, I think he just gets a bad rep. And I don't think he creates tragedy. I think he's a harbinger of doom who tries to warn us before it happens. Perhaps we haven't advanced enough to understand him and how he communicates. But I'm interested, dear listeners. What do you all think? Roughly around New Year's 2010, going into 2011, 3 friends and I, of ages 18 to 19, were in the Finger Lakes region of New York, staying at my aunt's lake house. During this trip, we were hitting local ski resorts during the day and hanging out drinking and smoking at night in the house. On this particular day, we visited Bristol Mountain and enjoyed the slopes all day. I had been there previously, while the others had not. Nothing out of the ordinary aside from enjoying a few joints throughout the day while on our runs. The incident in question happened on our ride home. Now, this was late 2010, so phone GPS was not common. I was navigating around using an old Garmin GPS which I had plugged into the cigarette lighter of my mid-90s GMC. It navigated us around just fine until it came to leaving Bristol. When we got to the car, I fired up the GPS and set the path back to the house and pulled out a pipe from the centre console. At this point, all of us were pretty tired and it was dark out, so we all decided to wait until we got back home to partake. This turned out to be a very smart choice. The strange thing is that the GPS did not route me to get back on the main road to head home. It actually directed us to a narrow opening straight into the woods which connected to the parking lot we were in. In my headspace I figured, why not follow the GPS, as it has not let us down all this week. Boy did I regret that choice. I followed the path and immediately we were driving down a dirt road about 1.5 cars lengths wide. Trees on both sides of the car, specifically those types of trees that are fairly skinny, with no branches for at least the bottom 10-ish feet. At this point it seems pretty eerie, but no one thinks too much of it. All you can really see are what the headlights are lighting up. Because of this, I'm not going very fast, probably 20 miles an hour max. I can't remember exactly how long we were on this path. Couldn't have been more than half a mile or so, but before I know it, I notice up ahead there's an opening in the trees to my right, not like a clearing but more so another road branching off. And this is where things get sketchy, and it feels like my mind is messing with me. As we approach the opening, it's clearer. This opening is more of a driveway, and I notice some sort of structure through the trees. My memory recalls it as a run-down cabin. I can't recall if there were cars there or not, because at the moment we got to the opening, there was what we can only describe as a werewolf sprinting at our car on all fours. As the driver, I had the most attention. I saw it take about 2 to 3 leaping steps from where it was, and essentially launched itself at the car as we went by. Its teeth were snarled, its hair was grey and scraggly, and it even made contact with the passenger side door and jolted the car a bit. And this all happened within about the span of 2 seconds. My front passenger said he looked up from his phone right as the creature was mid-leap, and his details of what he saw matched mine. The 2 rear passengers did not see this happen, but obviously felt the jolt of the car. Those 2 immediately turned around to look out the back window, but due to the darkness and ski equipment piled up, they couldn't see anything. Of course, we thought that maybe this could have been a dog, but frankly, I've never seen anything like this. And in my recollection of it, it probably had to be the height of a Great Dane while standing on all fours, and certainly looked like a wolf. For the past 15 years, my friends and I would joke about the time we saw a werewolf. But the more I dug into these things, the more confused I got. The path I knew we started on appears on no maps these days. Satellite images and all that provide no info. Even the area I know we drove into doesn't seem to match up with the reality of the landscape. It was flat in my memory, and the area seems to have an elevation, and the wooded area doesn't seem to be long enough for what we experienced to even be possible. The GPS we used is long gone, and frankly was extremely outdated at the time we were even using it. I can't remember any details of how we navigated out of the woods. Obviously we continued to follow the GPS and it got us home in the end, but the thing that specifically sticks out to me is the image of that thing in a full lunge at my car. Anyway, I'm sharing this in hopes literally anyone can advise on any memory of that road that we took, or a possible similar experience in the area. I have been wanting to share this experience that happened to my aunt about 60 years ago when she was a child of about 6. and curious to get your thoughts. My family owns a few acres of land in the mountains outside of a small town in Honduras that has been around since the 1800s. One day, my aunt and her siblings were wandering around these lands looking for guavas, as they are wild fruits that grow in the area. She said she noticed a guava that was super big and ripe. She describes it as the perfect guava. So naturally she walks over to try and collect it. But she's noticed that as she reaches for it, it was just slightly out of her reach. So she keeps going after it, walking further and further until she finally loses it. She looks up. It's dark, mind you, and it was midday when she started picking the guavas, and she no longer recognizes her surroundings. The path she was on was nowhere in sight, and she was just standing in the middle of heavy foliage. Then, out of the bushes, pops out a small man with a big, oversized, pointy hat, and she said she couldn't see his face. The locals refer to this creature as El Duende, which is Spanish for goblin or gnome. She said it felt like he was trying to scare her. He would pop out, tug at her clothes, and hide again. She said it was also trying to grab at the crucifix necklace she was wearing, as my family are very Catholic and they all wore these. Once she noticed it was trying to grab her necklace, she said she held onto the cross super tight, closed her eyes and started to pray. Once she stopped, she opened her eyes and it was daylight again and 2 white doves appeared on a clear path. So she followed them. She said she couldn't grab the doves, but they were very near her, and the doves eventually led her to the cabin where her parents and siblings were staying. When she got home, everyone was hysterical. She had been missing for 24 hours. They had a search party looking for her and calling her name. No one understands how she couldn't hear them calling for her because she couldn't have gone very far. When she got back, she was so tired. She went to bed and awoke with a bad fever. She was pale and had cold sweats, and ever since then she's been extremely religious. She swears praying to God saved her from El Duende, and that the 2 doves who came to her aid were angels. There have been other cases like this in the area. The victims are usually little girls between the ages of 5 and 8, and it's always the same story. The little girl goes missing and comes back later, claiming they encountered a little man with a tall pointy hat. I'm wondering if anyone else has had a similar encounter to this. This did take place in Central America, but I'm wondering if it has happened to others in other places of the world too. Several months ago, I'd say probably around February or March, I was at a park with one of my friends after dark. We had gone there frequently, and nothing had ever seemed weird. My friend was standing off to the side of a shed a few hundred feet away from me, and I was sitting in my car. I had been zoned out, looking at stuff on my phone, and he had been talking on the phone with someone. It wasn't until I heard this strange barking that it didn't sound human or animal per se. I couldn't figure out which direction it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from every direction. I looked up and saw my friend quickly walking down the hill before coming to a dead stop mid-step. When I looked around, I saw out of the side mirror something standing up on all fours behind my car and sprinting off way too quickly into the surrounding woods. My friend came running to my car, getting in it and locking the door before saying, "Did you see that thing?" It wasn't human. It looked like it, but it was way too tall and skinny. It had run up behind your car and then it was going behind your car. It squatted down on all fours and then got up and ran off. The second encounter happened a few months after, right around the start of spring. I was with 3 of my friends and one of their dads. We were in the middle of the woods at one of their campgrounds. They had gone off for a walk probably 20 to 30 minutes ago, and I had stayed back to watch the fire. Suddenly, as the world had gone almost silent, I almost felt like I wasn't even in our world anymore. It's hard to explain. I heard this woman screaming, and I just sat there staring at the direction that I thought the noise was coming from, which was deeper in the woods. At first I thought it was maybe one of my friends yelling, but none of them sound like that. Something had been off about this voice, and after a few minutes it trailed off and got quieter as the world returned back to normal. My friends had returned after another 15 to 20 minutes from a different direction than I heard the voice. So if anyone knows what these encounters are or has had similar experiences, I'd very much like to know. I've grown up in the woods, camping, fishing and hunting, and I'm used to everything and have seen most things there are to see. And I've watched horror movies since I was 10 and nothing seems to bother me anymore. Well, around 10 years ago, my wife and I got a cabin in a campground to check out. It was the last cabin in a group of 3 at the forest's edge, at the very back corner of the campground. This place was not even in the backwoods. We had phone service and it was outside of Bedford, Pennsylvania. The campground wasn't busy at all. We did our usual campfire that evening, with no issues or anything strange, and I remember seeing a flying squirrel whiz past us, which is pretty uncommon but still cool to see. We put out the fire, and my wife went into the cabin to get ready for bed. The cabin had a small open porch with a porch light, and I went inside, but my cousin called, so I stepped out on the porch to talk. All I remember is walking around the porch, talking, and when I went to the far side facing the forest's edge, I froze. My entire body is covered in goosebumps now as I read this out. But it was a small, bipedal, grey-coloured creature. It just stared at me, never moving, and it couldn't have been more than 2 feet tall. The colour is what really caught my attention. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. The way it stood out in the darkness. I couldn't make out its features, but I slowly backed away into the doorway, never taking my eyes off it. It was right off the porch, just out of the light, maybe 5 feet away. Just at the edge of the woods. My wife said she never saw me look so scared in all the years we've been together. She knew something was wrong. My cousin said I just went silent and then hung up the phone. I went back out maybe 30 minutes after and it was gone. The next morning everything was fine. We took a hike, came back and made lunch. And after lunch, we were inside again and everything in the cabin started to shake. And one of the loudest sounds I've ever heard flew over us. It only lasted a few seconds. We went outside and saw a few people outside also looking around. Then it happened again. Fighter jets flying so low over the top of this area. No idea if they were looking for something or just standard military training, but it was freaky. We left right after they'd flown over us a few times. We've been back to this campground since. Nothing strange has happened again, but I do not stay in that cabin. I was talking to a good friend last year who was very into the supernatural, and he mentioned the Pukwudgie after I told my story, so I looked it up. It very well could have been, as part of me always thought it was an alien or something, especially with the fighter jets the next day. I hope you enjoyed. Please let me know if you have any questions. My name is Nora, and this happened when I was around 8 years old. I've never been able to fully explain this. It happened during a family trip to a large park with forest trails near where we lived. I had just gotten a brand new bike for my birthday, and as any 8-year-old would be, completely obsessed with it. And I remember begging my parents all morning to let me ride it during the walk, because I needed to show everyone how fast I could ride. Eventually they gave in, figuring the trails were safe enough and I'd stayed nearby. At first, the whole day felt completely ordinary. There were other families walking around, kids outside, the usual park activity you'd expect. Since I was the only one with a bike, I kept speeding ahead of my parents and then circling back towards them before racing off again. I felt very grown up being trusted to ride a little further ahead on my own. Eventually we reached this strange fork in the trail that I still remember clearly. In my mind, I thought the path worked like a simple roundabout where both sides eventually reconnected. Looking back now, I realized there was a smaller trail branching off between the main path that I didn't notice at first. Because I was ahead of my parents and moving too fast, I assumed the first trail I saw was the correct one, and rode straight into it without thinking. And of course, everything changed, because the trail became quieter and more narrow than the main path, and there were no longer other people around. I remember realizing I couldn't hear my parents behind me and began to feel nervous, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to admit that I'd gone the wrong way. Then only a minute or two after turning onto the trail, my front wheel suddenly dropped into a ditch beside the path, and I flew sideways off the bike and landed hard in the dirt. I wasn't seriously hurt, but the bike got jammed awkwardly in the ditch. At 8 years old, I wasn't strong enough to pull it out, no matter how hard I tried. I panicked almost immediately, and that's when I realized I was alone, lost, and couldn't even get my bike free. And then out of frustration I began to cry. While I was standing there trying to yank the bike loose, I looked further down the trail hoping maybe another person would come by and help me. And that was the moment I saw these people. I thought they were just standing further down the path, but something about them looked different. There were 4 figures grouped together in a sort of loose semicircle. They looked human-shaped, but not fully human. Even now I struggle to explain it, because my brain never found the right comparison for what they looked like. The closest thing I can think of is mannequins or robots, except darker and less defined. They looked almost shadow-like. One detail that has stuck with me after all these years is that they were wearing something shaped almost like a skirt, except it hung in this stiff, curved way that didn't move naturally. Everything about them looked unnatural. And what frightened me more was that they seemed to be getting larger. At the time, my child brain interpreted that as them moving closer towards me, although I honestly never remember seeing actual walking movements. I just remember looking at them 1 second, glancing back down at my bike, and then realizing when I looked up again that they somehow seemed closer than before. And I was terrified. Part of me wanted to abandon the bike and run back the way I came. But I loved that bike, and simply could not bring myself to leave it there. And I was standing by the ditch crying and staring at the figures. The forest suddenly felt unbelievably quiet around me. I don't remember hearing anything anymore. Thankfully, before anything else happened, another family came down the trail from behind me, and the second they appeared, I looked back towards where the figures had been standing and nothing was there anymore. The family graciously pulled the bike out of the ditch and stayed with me until my parents finally found me. I remember trying to explain what I'd seen, but I was crying too hard and no one really understood what I meant. My parents assumed I'd scared myself after getting lost in the woods, which sort of does make sense. I still remember those figures though. I just wish I knew what they were. I'm super experienced with extreme rugged camping. I avoid cold at all costs. It's not my cup of tea, but heat and rugged, I adore it. I ride out on the quad usually to remote locations and often cowboy camp, literally face down in the dirt and mud. Well, this year I ventured out and found an off-the-grid site that had an old iron trash can as a fire pit and a picnic table. It was in the middle of boonies nowhere. About 10 minutes go by after I shut the quad off. I begin hearing these odd screaming sounds, with reverb, off the far southeast distance of my position moving northeast. I didn't think much of it at all. Firstly, I thought it could be some fired up riders passing through, or something as quite common. It being a Tuesday though, I barely saw anyone out there that entire week until Friday, and I did not scare easily at all. That's when I noticed it was getting closer to me and I began rolling film. It sounded like a male adult primarily screaming in dying agony. Some type of creature, and either an adult female screaming or a small child screaming. All at once with reverb. The way the sound was bouncing through the trees was downright bizarre. No echo I've really ever heard in my life in the woods. It all suddenly phased into sounding like it was completely surrounding me, and then suddenly halts. I then hear unintelligible words screaming for the male with reverb in the northwest of my location. The female or little child starts screaming back from the same location. More words screaming commenced as some other rider came chasing up after for whatever reason. I halted the guy on the bike and he said he had no idea what it was, but was following it to try and see what it was. No clue if he ever came across it. It began moving quickly off in the distance again, and the rider took off immediately thereafter. I've never heard anything like this in my entire life of camping and riding, and I've had hundreds of excursions at this point. The state I was in was known for the Wolfman and other cryptids, if one believes in folklore, I suppose. I never encountered any creatures high on in my life, so I can't personally say if they exist or not, but I don't dismiss anything as it can't totally be ruled out. Does anyone out there think they know what it could have been? I live in Bend and moved out here in 2017. I love the outdoors and go camping and hiking with just me and my dog a lot, and was watching a show called The Outsider on HBO with my fiancée. And she asked me if I had ever heard anyone in the middle of nowhere call to me, or whistle, or ask for help. I told her no. I was not aware that this was a thing, and she told me that if you ever hear that, do not answer and calmly get out of there, that something is trying to lure you to it. She said a lot of times it would sound like a familiar voice. Anyway, she told me about this couple a few weeks ago, and it creeped the hell out of me. I can't stop looking into this stuff now. I was talking to my mum about some of the stories I had been reading and had heard on podcasts, and she brought up something that happened that I told her about in 2019 that I never put much thought into until now. Anyway, I live on the outskirts of Bend in the desert, and in 2019, I lived there with my girlfriend at the time. I used to go walking through the desert alone with my dog all the time, sometime bringing a few beers and hanging out. One morning, a sheriff showed up at about 6 a.m. and asked me what I was doing walking around my neighbor's property at 2 a.m. that morning. Everyone out in this area is spaced pretty far apart, at least a good 300 yards, and I was still asleep when the officer showed up and didn't think anything of it, but told him I wasn't walking around on any neighbor's property with my dog at 2 a.m, and why would I even do that? Everyone has guns out here. You don't go messing around on 2 a.m. on anyone's property. He said she showed him the video, and it looked just like me and the dog that he's looking at right now. I was kind of rude at this point and told him I wasn't on the neighbor's property and that I was asleep at 2 a.m. and got my girlfriend to confirm it, and he still didn't seem convinced. I know for a fact if you do something like that, you're probably messing around and hoping to be shot, at least in these parts. But anyway, I wanted to share this with all of you, because I'm convinced there's some high strangeness going on, because although it looks like me, it wasn't me. So there must have been something imitating us out there that night that were captured on video. As to what, I cannot say. Perhaps you might know. It was August, a few years before COVID, and I was 15. This is very important information to the story, and at the time I identified as transmasc, but now I use they/them pronouns. So, my mum lived up in a cute North Carolina mountain town, deep in southern Appalachia. My parents had been separated for a few years, and I spent the summers alone with my mum in the mountains. Now, my mum is physically disabled, and while she is perfectly self-sufficient, groundskeeping and outdoor yard work was not a possibility for her. This house was beautiful, in a nice neighborhood too. We had neighbors close to us on either side, and a domestic road, as opposed to a highway/main road, right in front of our house. We still lived in a rural area, but there were at least other people around us. I'm trying to stress that we were not off the grid in a cabin. This story starts when my mum was complaining of hearing scraping on the sides of the house at night. Seeing as I'm the man of the house, this falls to me, and I was excited to handle it. I go outside with my friend next door, and we examine the problem. Part of the paneling on the house had clearly been ripped off. That probably sounds suspicious to non-rural people, but to us we know it's just an animal. Real Appalachians don't believe in that pulp culture folklore about spirits and skinwalkers. The mountains have lots of animals that can hurt you plenty. We don't need to make up monsters to scare us away from the woods. Anyway, my friend had an extra doorbell camera, one of the motion capture kind, and we set it up on my mum's window on the first floor, right above where the paneling had been torn off. That way we could see the size of the animal we were dealing with, and if the animal might be hurt or needing an intervention from nearby wildlife services. Obviously I'm 15 and can't fix the paneling by myself, so I tell my mum everything and we just wait. A few days go by and sure enough I get a buzz on the phone in the middle of the night. It was the outside camera, and I opened the app. My stomach dropped into my arse. It was a bear. I couldn't see the details because it was about 3/4 of the way upwards from view, but I knew it was a big animal, and it definitely needed wildlife involvement. I could see its whole body and it looked sick. It had patches of bald spots and a really sallow face. It was scary at first, but then sad once I realized this thing needed help. The next day I sent my friend the video, showed my mum, and we called animal control. This is pretty usual for my area, plus I volunteered at animal shelters and have a big soft spot for wildlife rehab. An officer came to our house and came inside to get the full details. He planned to TNR the bear, trap and release, which means hopefully they would check if the bear was okay and didn't have any communicable diseases, and if it was safe to release the bear deeper into a nearby preservation/protected forested area. So we talked and I showed him the video. I was so excited during all of this that I was being an adult and masculine and protecting my home, and that's why I was eager to get all of this sorted and to make sure the bear was alright. But when I showed the officer the video of the bear, I have never until this day seen anyone's face go quite literally white. He looked like he was about to puke. He calmly said, "Ma'am, I think you need to call the police, because bears' legs do not bend that way." After we did call the police, they said there was nothing they could do unless whatever it was came back, but it never did. It scared the absolute loving crap out of my mum and I, and she moved out a few months later. Could have just been a bear with mange, or it could have been a skinwalker. I've spent a lot of time out in the woods in Oregon. I would drive an ATV sometimes or just hike up there. I went several times a week for years, and usually in Paulina National Forest. I've seen a lot of strange things. I'll try to avoid the weirdest ones. Many of them were encounters with people behaving strangely, and a few with animals. I was up there sometime in the afternoon. I took an old fire road on my ATV, and I'd been out about an hour, so it gets kind of desolate up there if you start taking the logging trails and so on. I'd bring extra gas because of how far I'd go. I remember I was going probably around 15 miles an hour, and I had to hit the front and back brakes because I saw something crossing the road up ahead, and it's hard to stop on loose rock. It was huge. At a distance I thought it was a deer or something. Then when I got close, it looked like a massive dog. I stopped. All of the dust flew about me, and I was stunned because it was the biggest black wolf I'd ever seen. At this time, they hadn't released the wolves into Oregon again as far as I knew, so I was just sitting there on my ATV frozen as this giant wolf sauntered across the road. It didn't seem to care about the noise I made or all the dust. It didn't even move out of the road quickly. It was walking very slowly, but it stopped finally to look at me, and it had these incredible yellow eyes. We locked gazes, and it just creeped the hell out of me. It stood there completely still, just staring. I wasn't sure what to do, or if it was going to come towards me. It gave zero craps that I was just sitting there parked on my noisy, idling ATV, when it turned and disappeared into the brush. I still to this day think it wasn't a wolf, or at least not an ordinary one. I know wolves are big. I had a 120-pound wolf dog, and he looked and acted nothing like this. This thing was wild and had these incredible eyes. It also had no concern about me in the slightest. I'm an average-sized woman, but just the same, wolves generally avoid people and will run off if they see you. But there was something about the way it was so quiet that has stuck with me all these years. I've never seen anything like it before or since, and just remembering it gives me chills. When I was a child of maybe 7, I was staying with my grandmother in her old farmhouse. I slept on the sofa in the living room and woke up in the middle of the night with a start. I looked around the room and saw a hideous old woman walking through the wall from the adjacent room, past the sofa where I was sleeping, and then through the outer wall into the courtyard. She looked as if she were made of paper mache, with a large, round head. When she was right in front of me, she turned her head and looked at me before continuing on. As she was passing through the wall, I could see that her back was completely hollowed out. I recognized that it was probably just a dream, but I remember it vividly. Even now, 35 years later, I rarely recall anything from my dreams, and never have, but this is the only dream I recall in detail. When I grew older, I learned about the Elle folk. In Scandinavian folklore, the Elle woman is described as old and ugly, with sagging breasts and a hollowed back. I didn't notice her breasts, but her back was hollow all right. I found out that in Danish, Elle woman is also called slattenpatten. I apparently talked a lot about this to my parents, so it obviously unsettled me at the time, and I still think about it occasionally. It is, after all, really weird.